Chapter 19. Battling in the Arena. Slowly, I regained my composure and finally tried again to remove the keys from the dead body of my former jailer. But as I reached out into the darkness to locate it, I found to my horror that it was gone. Then the truth flashed on me. The owners of those gleaming eyes had dragged my prize away from me to be devoured in their neighboring lair. They had been waiting for days, for weeks, for months, through all this awful eternity of my imprisonment, to drag my dead carcass to their feast. For 2 days, no food was brought to me, but then a new messenger appeared, and my incarceration went on as before. But not again did I allow my reason to be submerged by the horror of my position. Shortly after this episode, another prisoner was brought in and chained near me by the dim torchlight. I saw that he was a red Martian, and I could scarcely await the departure of his guards to address him. As their retreating footsteps died away in the distance, I called out softly the Martian word of greeting. "Kerr?" "Who are you who speaks out of the darkness?" he answered. "John Carter, a friend of the Red Men of Helium." "I am from Helium," he said, "but I do not recall your name." And then I told him my story as I have written it here, omitting only any reference to my love for Dejah Thoris. He was very excited by the news of Helium's princess, and seemed quite positive that she and Sola could easily have reached a point of safety from where they left me. He said that he knew the place well because the defile through which the Warhoon warriors had passed when they discovered us was the only one ever used by them when marching to the south. Dejah Thoris and Sola entered the hills not 5 miles from a great waterway, and are now probably quite safe, he assured me. My fellow prisoner was Cantos Can, a Pad War lieutenant in the Navy of Helium. He had been a member of the ill-fated expedition which had fallen into the hands of the Tharks at the time of Dejah Thoris' capture. He briefly related the events that followed the defeat of the battleships. Badly injured and only partially manned, they had limped slowly toward Helium. But while passing near the city of Zodanga, the capital of Helium's hereditary enemies, among the Red Men of Barsoom, they had been attacked by a great body of warships. All but the craft to which Cantos can belong were either destroyed or captured. His vessel was chased for days by 3 of the Zodangan warships, but finally escaped during the darkness of a moonless night. 30 days after the capture of Dejah Thoris, or about the time of our coming to Thark, his vessel had reached Helium with about 10 survivors of the original crew of 700 officers and men. Immediately, 7 great fleets, each of 100 mighty warships, had been dispatched to search for Dejah Thoris. From these vessels, 2,000 smaller craft had been kept out continuously in futile search for the missing princess. 2 green Martian communities had been wiped off the face of Barsoom by the avenging fleets, but no trace of Dejah Thoris had been found. They had been searching among the northern hordes, and only within the past few days had they extended their quest to the south. Cantos can have been detailed to one of the small one-man flyers, and had had the misfortune to be discovered by the Warhoons while exploring their city. The bravery and daring of the man won my greatest respect and admiration. Alone, he had landed at the city's boundary, and on foot had penetrated to the buildings surrounding the plaza. For 2 days and nights, he had explored their quarters and their dungeons in search of his beloved princess, only to fall into the hands of a party of Warhoons as he was about to leave, after assuring himself that Dejah Thoris was not a captive there. During the period of our incarceration, Cantos Can and I became well acquainted and formed a warm personal friendship. A few days only elapsed, however, before we were dragged forth from our dungeon for the great games. We were conducted early one morning to an enormous amphitheater, which, instead of having been built upon the surface of the ground, was excavated below the surface. It had partially filled with debris, so that how large it had originally been was difficult to say. In its present condition, it held the entire 20,000 Warhoons of the assembled hordes. The arena was immense, but extremely uneven and unkempt. Around it, the Warhoons had piled building stone from some of the ruined edifices of the ancient city to prevent the animals and the captives from escaping into the audience. At each end had been constructed cages to hold them until their turns came to meet some horrible death upon the arena. Kanto's Can and I were confined together in one of the cages. In the others were wild Kalos, Thoats, mad Zitadars, green warriors and women of other hordes, and many strange and ferocious wild beasts of Barsoom, which I had never before seen. The din of their roaring, growling, and squealing was deafening, and the formidable appearance of any one of them was enough to make the stoutest heart feel grave forebodings. Kantos can explain to me that at the end of the day, one of these prisoners would gain freedom, and the others would lie dead about the arena. The winners in the various contests of the day would be pitted against each other until only two remained alive. The victor in the last encounter would be set free, whether animal or man. The following morning, the cages would be filled with a new consignment of victims, and so on throughout the 10 days of the games. Shortly after we had been caged, the amphitheater began to fill, and within an hour every available part of the seating space was occupied. Dak Kova, with his jeds and chieftains, sat at the center of one side of the arena upon a large, raised platform. At a signal from Dak Kova, the doors of 2 cages were thrown open, and a dozen green Martian females were driven to the center of the arena. Each was given a dagger, and then, at the far end, a pack of 12 Kalos, or wild dogs, were loosed upon them. As the brutes, growling and foaming, rushed upon the almost defenseless women, I turned my head so that I might not see the horrid sight. The yells and laughter of the green horde bore witness to the excellent quality of the sport. When I turned back to the arena, as Kantos told me was over, I saw 3 victorious Kalos, snarling and growling over the bodies of their prey. The women had given a good account of themselves. Next, a mad Zitadar was loose among the remaining dogs, and so it went throughout the long, hot, horrible day. During the day, I was pitted against first men and then beasts, but as I was armed with a long sword and always outclassed my adversary in agility and generally in strength as well, it proved but child's play to me. Time and time again, I won the applause of the bloodthirsty multitude, and toward the end, there were cries that I be taken from the arena and be made a member of the hordes of Warhoon. Finally, there were but 3 of us left, a great green warrior of some far northern horde, Kantos Can and myself. The other 2 were to battle, and then I was to fight the conqueror for the liberty which was accorded the final winner. Kantos Can had fought several times during the day and, like myself, had always proven victorious, but occasionally by the smallest of margins, especially when pitted against the green warriors. I had little hope that he could best his giant adversary, who had mowed down all before him during the day. The fellow towered nearly 16 feet in height, while Kantos Can was some inches under 6 feet. As they advanced to meet one another, I saw for the first time a trick of Martian swordsmanship, which centered Kantos Can's every hope of victory in life on one cast of the dice. For, as he came to within about 20 feet of the huge fellow, he threw his sword arm far behind him over his shoulder, and with a mighty sweep hurled his weapon point foremost at the green warrior. It flew true as an arrow, and, piercing the poor devil's heart, laid him dead upon the arena. Kantos Can and I were now pitted against each other, but as we approached the encounter, I whispered to him to prolong the battle until nearly dark in the hope that we might find some means of escape. The horde evidently guessed that we had no hearts to fight each other, and so they howled in rage as neither of us placed a fatal thrust. Just as I saw the sudden coming of darkness, I whispered to Kantos Can to thrust his sword between my left arm and my body. As he did so, I staggered back, clasping the sword tightly with my arm, and thus fell to the ground with his weapon apparently protruding from my chest. Kantos Can perceive my coup, and stepping quickly to my side, he placed his foot upon my neck, and withdrawing his sword from my body, gave me the final death blow through the neck, which is supposed to sever the jugular vein. But in this instance, the cold blade slipped harmlessly into the sand of the arena. In the darkness which had now fallen, none could tell but that he had really finished me. I whispered to him to go and claim his freedom, and then look for me in the hills east of the city, and so he left me. When the amphitheater had cleared, I crept stealthily to the top, and as the great excavation lay far from the plaza and in an untenanted portion of the great dead city, I had little trouble in reaching the hills beyond. Chapter 20. In the Atmosphere Factory. For 2 days, I waited for Cantos, Kansas. When he didn't arrive, I set off on foot in a northwesterly direction. I aimed for a waterway he had mentioned as the nearest. My only food was a vegetable milk from abundant plants, a truly priceless fluid. For 2 long weeks, I wandered, stumbling through the nights, guided only by the stars. During the days, I hid behind protruding rocks or among the sparse hills I traversed. Wild beasts attacked me several times, strange, monstrous creatures that leaped from the dark. I had to keep my long sword ready. Usually, my newly acquired telepathic power warned me well in advance. But once, I was knocked down, vicious fangs of my jugular, a hairy face pressed close to mine, before I even knew I was threatened. I didn't know what kind of creature was upon me, but I could feel it was large, heavy, and many-legged. My hands found its throat before its fangs could bury themselves in my neck. Slowly, I forced the hairy face away and clamped my fingers vice-like upon its windpipe. We lay there silently, the beast struggling with all its might to reach me with those awful fangs. I strained to maintain my grip, choking the life from it, keeping it from my throat. Slowly, my arms began to give way in the unequal struggle. Inch by inch, the burning eyes and gleaming tusks of my attacker crept closer. As the hairy face touched mine again, I realized all was lost. Just then, a living mass of destruction sprang from the surrounding darkness, landing full upon the creature that held me pinned to the ground. The two rolled, growling, upon the moss, tearing and rending each other frightfully. But it was soon over. My preserver stood with lowered head over the throat of the dead thing that would have killed me. The nearer moon, suddenly hurtling above the horizon, lit up the Barsoomian scene. It showed me that my preserver was Woola. Where he had come from, or how he found me, I couldn't guess. That I was glad of his companionship goes without saying, but my pleasure at seeing him was tempered by anxiety. Why had he left Dejah Thoris? Only her death, I felt sure, could account for his absence from her, knowing how faithful he was to my commands. By the light of the now brilliant moons, I saw he was a mere shadow of his former self. As he turned from my caress and began greedily devouring the dead carcass at my feet, I realized the poor fellow was more than half-starved. My own plight was only slightly better, but I couldn't bring myself to eat uncooked flesh, and I had no means of making a fire. When Woola finished his meal, I again resumed my weary, seemingly endless wandering in quest of the elusive waterway. At daybreak on the 15th day of my search, I was overjoyed to see the tall trees that marked my objective. Around noon, I wearily dragged myself to the portals of a massive building, perhaps 4 square miles in area and 200 feet high. Its mighty walls showed no opening other than the tiny door where I collapsed, exhausted. There was no sign of life around it. I found no bell or other way to alert anyone inside, unless a small round hole near the door was for that purpose. It was about the size of a lead pencil. Thinking it might be a speaking tube, I put my mouth to it and was about to call when a voice issued from it, asking who I was, where I was from, and the nature of my errand. I explained I had escaped from the Warhoons and was dying of starvation and exhaustion. The voice replied, "You wear the metal of a green warrior and are followed by a Kalo, yet you have the figure of a red man. In color, you are neither green nor red. In the name of the 9th ray, what man or creature are you?" "I am a friend of the red men of Barsoom, and I am starving. In the name of humanity, open to us." I replied. Presently, the door began to recede, sinking 50 feet into the wall. Then it stopped and slid easily to the left, exposing a short, narrow concrete corridor. At its far end was another door, identical to the first. No one was in sight. Yet as soon as we passed the first door, it slid gently into place behind us and rapidly receded to its original position in the building's front wall. As the door had slipped aside, I noted its great thickness, fully 20 feet. As it reached its place once more after closing behind us, great steel cylinders dropped from the ceiling behind it, fitting their lower ends into apertures countersunk in the floor. A second and third door receded before me and slid to one side, just like the first. I then reached a large inner chamber where I found food and drink laid out on a great stone table. A voice directed me to satisfy my hunger and to feed my callow. While I was thus engaged, my invisible host put me through severe and searching cross-examination. "Your statements are most remarkable," the voice said, concluding its questioning. "But you are evidently speaking the truth. It is equally evident that you are not Barsoom. I can tell that by the conformation of your brain, the strange location of your internal organs, and the shape and size of your heart. Can you see through me?" I exclaimed. "Yes, I can see all but your thoughts. If you were a Barsoomian, I could read those." Then a door opened on the far side of the chamber, and a strange, dried-up little mummy of a man came toward me. He wore only a single article of clothing or adornment, a small gold collar from which a great ornament hung upon his chest. It was as large as a dinner plate, solid with huge diamonds, except for the exact center, which held a strange stone an inch in diameter. This stone scintillated 9 different and distinct rays, the 7 colors of our earthly prism, and 2 beautiful rays which to me were new and nameless. I cannot describe them any more than you could describe red to a blind man. I only know that they were beautiful in the extreme. The old man sat and talked with me for hours. The strangest part of our interaction was that I could read his every thought, while he could not fathom an iota from my mind unless I spoke. I did not inform him of my ability to sense his mental operations. Thus, I learned a great deal that proved immensely valuable to me later. I would never have known these things had he suspected my strange power, for Martians have such perfect control of their mental machinery that they can direct their thoughts with absolute precision. The building in which I found myself contained the machinery that produces the artificial atmosphere sustaining life on Mars. The secret of the entire process hinges on the use of the 9th ray, one of the beautiful scintillations I had noted emanating from the great stone in my host's diadem. This ray is separated from the other rays of the sun by finely adjusted instruments on the roof of the huge building. 3/4 of the building is used for reservoirs where the 9th ray is stored. This product is then treated electrically, or rather, certain proportions of refined electric vibrations are incorporated with it. The result is then pumped to the planet's 5 principal air centers where, as it is released, contact with the ether of space transforms it into atmosphere. There is always enough of the 9th ray stored in the great building to maintain the current Martian atmosphere for 1,000 years. The only fear, as my new friend told me, was that some accident might befall the pumping apparatus. He led me to an inner chamber, where I saw a battery of 20 radium pumps. Any one of them was capable of furnishing all Mars with the atmosphere compound. For 800 years, he told me, he had watched these pumps, which he used alternately, a day each at a stretch, a little over 24.5 Earth hours. He has one assistant who divides a watch with him. Each of these men spends half a Martian year, about 344 of our days, alone in this huge, isolated plant. Every red Martian is taught the principles of atmosphere manufacture during earliest childhood, but only 2 at a time ever hold the secret of entry to the great building, built with walls 150 feet thick. It is absolutely unassailable. Even the roof is guarded from aircraft assault by a 5-foot-thick glass covering. Their only fear of attack is from the green Martians or some demented red man. All Barsoomians realize that the very existence of every form of life on Mars depends on the uninterrupted working of this plant. One curious fact I discovered as I watched his thoughts was that the outer doors are manipulated by telepathic means. The locks are so finely adjusted that the doors are released by a certain combination of thought waves. To experiment with my newfound toy, I thought to surprise him into revealing this combination. So I casually asked him how he had managed to unlock the massive doors for me from the inner chambers of the building. Quick as a flash, 9 Martian sounds leaped to his mind, but they faded just as quickly as he answered that this was a secret he must not divulge. From then on, his manner toward me changed, as though he feared he had been surprised into divulging his great secret. I read suspicion and fear in his looks and thoughts, though his words were still fair. Before I retired for the night, he promised to give me a letter to a nearby agricultural officer who would help me on my way to Zodanga, which, he said, was the nearest Martian city. But be sure you do not let them know you are bound for Helium, he added, as they are at war with that country. My assistant and I are of no country. We belong to all Barsoom, and this talisman we will protect us in all lands, even among the green men, though we do not trust ourselves to their hands if we can avoid it. And so, good night, my friend, he continued. May you have a long and restful sleep. Yes, a long sleep. And though he smiled pleasantly, I saw in his thoughts the wish that he had never admitted me. Then came a picture of him standing over me in the night, the swift thrust of a long dagger and the half-formed words, I am sorry, but it is for the best good of Barsoom. As he closed the door of my chamber behind him, his thoughts were cut off from me, as was the sight of him. This seemed strange to me, with my limited knowledge of thought transference. What was I to do? How could I escape through these mighty walls? I could easily kill him now that I was warned. But once he was dead, I could no longer escape, and with the stopping of the great plant's machinery, I would die with all the other inhabitants of the planet. All, even Dejah Thoris, if she were not already dead. For the others, I cared not a bit. But the thought of Dejah Thoris drove from my mind all desire to kill my mistaken host. Cautiously, I opened the door of my apartment and, followed by Woola, sought the innermost of the great doors. A wild scheme had come to me. I would attempt to force the great locks by the 9 thought waves I had read in my host's mind. Creeping stealthily through corridor after corridor and down winding runways that turned this way and that, I finally reached the great hall where I had broken my long fast that morning. Nowhere had I seen my host, nor did I know where he kept himself by night. I was about to step boldly into the room when a slight noise behind me warned me back into the shadows of a recess in the corridor. Dragging Woola after me, I crouched low in the darkness. Presently, the old man passed close by me. As he entered the dimly lit chamber I had been about to pass through, I saw he held a long, thin dagger and was sharpening it on a stone. In his mind was a decision to inspect the radium pumps, which would take about 30 minutes, and then return to my bedchamber and finish me. As he passed through the great hall and disappeared down the runway leading to the pump room, I stole stealthily from my hiding place and crossed the great door, the innermost of the 3 that stood between me and liberty. Concentrating my mind upon the massive lock, I hurled the 9 thought waves against it. In breathless expectancy, I waited. Finally, the great door moved softly toward me and slid quietly to one side. One after the other, the remaining mighty portals opened at my command. Woola and I stepped forth into the darkness, free, but little better off than we had been before, except that we had full stomachs. Hastening away from the shadows of the formidable pile, I made for first crossroad, intending to reach the central turnpike as quickly as possible. I arrived around morning, and, entering the first enclosure, I came to search for signs of habitation. There were low, rambling concrete buildings barred with heavy, impassable doors. No amount of hammering or hallooing brought any response. Weary and exhausted from sleeplessness, I threw myself upon the ground, commanding Woola to stand guard. Some time later, I was awakened by his frightful growlings and opened my eyes to see 3 red Martians standing a short distance from us, covering me with their rifles. I am unarmed and no enemy, I hastened to explain. I have been a prisoner among the green men, and am on my way to Zodanga. All I ask is food and rest of myself and my callow, and proper directions for reaching my destination. They lowered their rifles and advanced pleasantly toward me, placing their right hands upon my left shoulder in their customary salute. They asked me many questions about myself and my wanderings. Then they took me to the house of one of them, which was only a short distance away. The buildings I had been hammering at earlier that morning were occupied only by livestock and farm produce. The actual house stood among a grove of enormous trees. Like all red Martian homes, it had been raised at night some 40 or 50 feet from the ground on a large, round metal shaft. This shaft slid up or down within a sleeve sunk in the ground and was operated by a tiny radium engine in the building's entrance hall. Instead of bothering with bolts and bars, red Martians simply raise their dwellings out of harm's way during the night. They also have private means for lowering or raising them from the ground. From outside, if they wish to go away and leave them, these brothers, with their wives and children, occupied 3 similar houses on this farm. They did not work themselves, being government officers in charge. The labor was performed by convicts, prisoners of war, delinquent debtors, and confirmed bachelors too poor to pay the high celibate tax imposed by all red Martian governments. They were the personification of cordiality and hospitality. I spent several days with them, resting and recuperating from my long and arduous experiences. When they had heard my story, I omitted all reference to Dejah Thoris and the old man of the atmosphere plant. They advised me to color my body to more closely resemble their own race. Then, they suggested I try to find employment in Zodanga, either in the Army or the Navy. The chances are small that your tale will be believed until you have proven your trustworthiness and won friends among the higher nobles of the court, one of them explained. This you can most easily do through military service, as we are a warlike people on Barsoom, and save our richest favors for the fighting man. When I was ready to depart, they furnished me with a small domestic bullthoat, such as is used for saddle purposes by all red Martians. The animal is about the size of a horse and quite gentle, but in color and shape, it is an exact replica of its huge and fierce cousin of the wilds. The brothers had supplied me with a reddish oil, with which I anointed my entire body. One of them cut my hair, which had grown quite long, in the prevailing fashion of the time, square at the back and banged in front. I could have passed anywhere on Barsoom as a full-fledged red Martian. My medal and ornaments were also renewed in the style of the Zodangan gentleman, attached to the House of Tor, which was a family name of my benefactors. They filled a small sack at my side with Zodangan money. The medium of exchange on Mars is not dissimilar from our own, except that the coins are oval. Paper money is issued by individuals as they require it and redeemed twice yearly. If a man issues more than he can redeem, the government pays his creditors in full, and the debtor works out the amount on the farms or in mines, which are all government-owned. This suits everyone except the debtor, as it has been difficult to obtain enough voluntary labor to work the great isolated farmlands of Mars, which stretch like narrow ribbons from pole to pole through wild stretches populated by wild animals and even wilder men. When I mentioned my inability to repay them for their kindness, they assured me I would have ample opportunity if I lived long on Barsoom. Bidding me farewell, they watched me until I was out of sight upon the broad white turnpike. Chapter 21. An Air Scout for Zodanga. As I journeyed towards Zodanga, many strange and interesting sights captured my attention. At the various farmhouses where I stopped, I learned much about Barsoomian customs and methods. The water that supplies Mars farms is collected in immense underground reservoirs at the poles, from melting ice caps. It's then pumped through long conduits to populated centers. Cultivated districts lie along both sides of these conduits, spanning their entire length. These districts are divided into tracts of similar size, each supervised by one or more government officers. Instead of flooding fields and wasting vast quantities of water through evaporation, the precious liquid is carried underground through a network of small pipes, directly to the roots of the plants. Crops on Mars are always uniform because there are no droughts, no rains, no high winds, and no insects or destructive birds. On this trip, I tasted meat for the first time since leaving Earth, large juicy steaks and chops from the well-fed domestic animals of the farms. I also enjoyed luscious fruits and vegetables, though nothing was exactly similar to earthly food. Every plant, flower, vegetable, and animal has been so refined by ages of careful, scientific cultivation and breeding that their earthly counterparts seem pale, gray, and characterless by comparison. At a second stop, I met some highly cultivated people of the noble class. During our conversation, we happened to speak of helium. One of the older men had been there on a diplomatic mission several years prior and spoke with regret about the conditions that seemed destined to keep these two countries at war. Helium, he said, rightly boasts the most beautiful women of Barsoom, and of all her treasures, the wondrous daughter of Mor's Kajak, Dejah Thoris, is the most exquisite flower. Why, he added, the people truly worship the ground she walks upon. Since her loss on that ill-starred expedition, all Helium has been draped in mourning. That our ruler attacked the disabled fleet as it returned to Helium was just another of his awful blunders. I fear it will sooner or later compel Zodanga to elevate a wiser man to his place. Even now, though our victorious armies surround Helium, the people of Zodanga are voicing their displeasure. The war is not a popular one, as it's not based on right or justice. Our forces took advantage of the principal Helium fleet's absence while they searched the princess, allowing us to easily reduce the city to a sorry plight. It said she will fall within the next few passages of the further moon. And what do you think may have been the fate of Princess Dejah Thoris? I asked as casually as possible. She is dead, he answered. We learned this from a green warrior recently captured by our forces in the south. She escaped from the hordes of Thark with a strange creature of another world, only to fall into the hands of the Warhoons. Their thoughts were found wandering on the sea bottom, and evidence of a bloody conflict was discovered nearby. While this information was not reassuring, it was also not conclusive proof of Dejah Thoris's death. So I resolved to make every effort to reach Helium as quickly as I could and deliver any news of his granddaughter's possible whereabouts to Tardo's moors. 10 days after leaving the Three Tor brothers, I arrived at Zodanga. From the moment I encountered the red inhabitants of Mars, I noticed that Woola drew a great deal of unwelcome attention to me. The huge brute belonged to a species never domesticated by the red men. Were one to stroll down Broadway with a Numidian lion at his heels, the effect would be similar to my entering Zodanga with Woola. The very thought of parting with the faithful creature caused me such regret and genuine sorrow that I put it off until just before we arrived at the city's gates. But then, finally, it became imperative that we separate. Had only my own safety or pleasure been at stake, no argument could have persuaded me to turn away the one creature on Barsoom who had never failed in demonstrating affection and loyalty. But as I would willingly have offered my life in service of the one I sought, for whom I was about to challenge the unknown dangers of this mysterious city, I could not allow even Woola's life to threaten the success of my venture, much less his momentary happiness, for I doubted not he would soon forget me. And so I bade the poor beast an affectionate farewell, promising him, however, that if I came through my adventure safely, I would find a way to seek him out. He seemed to understand me fully, and when I pointed back in the direction of Thark, he turned sorrowfully away. I couldn't bear to watch him go, but resolutely set my face towards Zodanga and, with a touch of heartsickness, approached her frowning walls. The letter I carried gave me immediate entrance to the vast, walled city. It was still very early morning, and the streets were practically deserted. The residences, raised high upon their metal columns, resembled huge rookeries, while the uprights themselves looked like steel tree trunks. The shops, as a rule, were not raised in the ground, nor were their doors bolted or barred, as thievery is practically unknown on Barsoom. Assassination is the ever-present fear of all Barsoomians, and for this reason alone, their homes are raised high above the ground at night or in times of danger. The Tor brothers had given me explicit directions to the part of the city where I could find living accommodations near the offices of the government agents to whom they had given me letters. My way led to the central square or plaza, a characteristic of all Martian cities. The plaza of Zodanga covers a square mile and is bounded by the palaces of the Jedak, the Jeds, and other royalty and nobility of Zodanga, as well as by the main public buildings, cafes, and shops. As I crossed the great square, lost in wonder and admiration of the magnificent architecture and the gorgeous scarlet vegetation carpeting the broad lawns, I saw a red Martian walking briskly toward me from one of the avenues. He paid not the slightest attention to me, but as he came abreast, I recognized him. Turning, I placed my hand on his shoulder, calling out, "Care, Cantos can." Like lightning he wheeled, and before I could even lower my hand, the point of his long sword was at my breast. "Who are you?" he growled. Then, as a backward leap carried me 50 feet from his sword, he dropped the point to the ground and exclaimed, laughing, "I don't need a better reply. There's only one man in all Barsoom who can bounce about like a rubber ball. By the mother of the further moon, John Carter, how did you come here? And have you become a Darseen, so that you can change your color at will?" "You gave me a bad half-minute, my friend," he continued, after I had briefly outlined my adventures since parting with him in the arena at Warhoon. Were my name and city known to the Zodangans, I would shortly be sitting on the banks of the lost Sea of Chorus with my revered and departed ancestors. I am here in the interest of Tardo's Moors, Jeddak of Helium, to discover the whereabouts of Dejah Thoris, our princess. Sabdan, Prince of Zodanga, has her hidden in the city and has fallen madly in love with her. His father, the Nkoses, Jeddak of Zodanga, has made her voluntary marriage to his son the price of peace between our countries. But Tardo's Moors will not agree to the demands, and has sent word that he and his people would rather look upon the dead face of their princess than see her wed anyone but her own choice. And that, personally, he would prefer being engulfed in the ashes of a lost and burning helium to joining the metal of his house with that of the Nkoses. His reply was the deadliest affront he could put upon the Nkoses and the Zodangans, but his people love him the most for it, and his strength in helium is greater today than ever. "I have been here 3 days," continued Candoskin, "but I have not yet found where Dejah Thoris is imprisoned. Today, I joined the Zodangan Navy as an air scout. I hope in this way to win the confidence of Sabdan, the prince who commands this division of the Navy, and thus learn Dejah Thoris's whereabouts. I am glad you are here, John Carter, for I know your loyalty to my princess, and 2 of us working together should be able to accomplish much." The plaza was now beginning to fill with people going about their daily activities. Shops were opening, and cafes were filling with early morning patrons. Cantoskin led me to one of these gorgeous eating places, where we were served entirely by mechanical apparatus. No hand touched the food from the time it entered the building in its raw state until it emerged hot and delicious upon the tables before the guests, in response to the touching of tiny buttons to indicate their desires. After our meal, Candoskin took me with him to the headquarters of the Air Scout Squadron and, introducing me to his superior, asked that I be enrolled as a member of the Corps. In accordance with custom, an examination was necessary, but Candoskin had told me to have no fear on this score, as he would attend to that part of the matter. He accomplished this by taking my order for examination to the examining officer and representing himself as John Carter. "This ruse will be discovered later," he cheerfully explained, "when they check my weights, measurements, and other personal identification data. But it will be several months before this is done, and our mission should be accomplished or have failed long before that time." The next few days were spent by Cantoskin teaching me the intricacies of flying and repairing the dainty little contrivances that Martians use for this purpose. The body of the one-man aircraft is about 16 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 3 inches thick, tapering to a point at each end. The driver sits on top of this plane on a seat constructed over the small, noiseless radium engine that propels it. The medium of buoyancy is contained within the thin metal walls of the body and consists of the 8th Barsoomian ray, or ray of propulsion, as it may be termed in view of its properties. This ray, like the 9th ray, is unknown on Earth, but the Martians have discovered that it is an inherent property of all light, no matter from what source it emanates. They have learned that it is the solar 8th ray that propels the light of the sun to the various planets, and that it is the individual 8th ray of each planet that reflects or propels the light thus obtained out into space once more. The solar 8th ray will be absorbed by the surface of Barsoom, but the Barsoomian 8th ray, which tends to propel light from Mars into space, is constantly streaming out from the planet, constituting a force of repulsion of gravity. When confined, this force can lift enormous weights from the ground. It is this ray that has enabled them to perfect aviation so much that battleships far outweighing anything known on Earth sail as gracefully and lightly through the thin air of Barsoom, as a toy balloon in Earth's heavy atmosphere. During the early years of this ray's discovery, many strange accidents occurred before the Martians learned to measure and control the wonderful power they had found. In one instance, some 900 years before, the first great battleship built with 8th-ray reservoirs was stored with too great a quantity of the rays. She had sailed up from Helium with 500 officers and men, never to return. Her power of repulsion for the planet was so great that it carried her far into space, where she can be seen today, with the aid of powerful telescopes, hurtling through the heavens 10,000 miles from Mars, a tiny satellite that will thus encircle Barsoom to the end of time. The 4th day after my arrival at Zodanga, I made my first flight, and as a result, I won a promotion that included quarters in Nkosi's palace. As I rose above the city, I circled several times, as I had seen Kandos can do, and then, throwing my engine into top speed, I raced at terrific velocity toward the south, following one of the great waterways that enters Zodanga from that direction. I had traversed perhaps 200 miles in a little less than an hour when I espied, far below me, a party of 3 green warriors racing madly toward a small figure on foot, who seemed to be trying to reach the confines of one of the walled fields. Dropping my machine rapidly toward them and circling to the rear of the warriors, I soon saw that the object of their pursuit was a red Martian, wearing the medal of the scout squadron to which I was attached. A short distance away lay his tiny flyer, surrounded by the tools with which he had evidently been occupied in repairing some damage when surprised by the green warriors. They were now almost upon him, their flying mounts charging down on the relatively puny figure at terrific speed, while the warriors leaned low to the right with their great metal-shod spears. Each seemed striving to be the first to impale the poor Zodangan, and in another moment his fate would have been sealed had it not been for my timely arrival. Driving my swift aircraft at high speed directly behind the warriors, I soon overtook them, and without diminishing my speed, I rammed the prow of my little flyer between the shoulders of the nearest. The impact, sufficient to have torn through inches of solid steel, hurled the fellow's headless body into the air over the head of his throat, where it fell sprawling upon the moss. The mounts of the other 2 warriors turned, squealing in terror, and bolted in opposite directions. Reducing my speed, I circled and came to ground at the feet of the astonished Zodangan. He was warm in his thanks for my timely aid and promise that my day's work would bring the reward it merited, for it was none other than a cousin of the Jedak of Zodanga whose life I had saved. We wasted no time in talking, as we knew the warriors would surely return as soon as they had gained control of their mounts. Hastening to his damaged machine, we bent every effort to finish the needed repairs, and had almost completed them when we saw the 2 green monsters returning at top speed from opposite sides of us. When they had approached within 100 yards, their thoughts again became unmanageable and absolutely refused to advance further toward the aircraft that had frightened them. The warriors finally dismounted and, hobbling their animals, advanced toward us on foot with drawn long swords. I advanced to meet the larger, telling the Zodangan to do the best he could with the other. Finishing my man with almost no effort, as had now from much practice become habitual with me, I hastened to return to my new acquaintance, whom I found indeed in desperate straits. He was wounded and down, with the huge foot of his antagonist upon his throat, and the great long sword raised to deal the final thrust. With a bound, I cleared the 50 feet intervening between us, and with an outstretched point, drove my sword completely through the body of the green warrior. His sword fell harmless to the ground, and he sank limply upon the prostrate form of the Zodangan. A cursory examination of the latter revealed no mortal injuries, and after a brief rest, he asserted that he felt fit to attempt a return voyage. He would have to pilot his own craft, however, as these frail vessels are not intended to convey more than a single person. Quickly completing the repairs, we rose together into the still, cloudless Martian sky, and at great speed and without further mishap, returned to Zodanga. As we neared the city, we discovered a mighty concourse of civilians and troops assembled upon the plain before the city. The sky was black with naval vessels and private and public pleasure craft, flying long streamers of gaily colored silks and banners and flags of odd and picturesque design. My companion signaled that I slow down, and running his machine close beside mine, suggested that we approach and watch the ceremony, which he said was for the purpose of conferring honors on individual officers and men for bravery and other distinguished service. He then unfurled a little ensign that denoted his craft bore a member of the royal family of Zodanga, and together we made our way through the maze of low-lying air vessels until we hung directly over the Jeddak of Zodanga and his staff. All were mounted upon the small domestic bulldogs of the red Martians, and their trappings and ornamentation bore such a quantity of gorgeously colored feathers that I couldn't help but be struck by the startling resemblance the Concours bore to a band of the Red Indians of my own earth. One of the staff called the attention of the Nkosis to my companion's presence above them, and the ruler motioned for him to descend. As they waited for the troops to move into position facing the Jeddak, the two talked earnestly together, the Jeddak and his staff occasionally glancing up at me. I couldn't hear their conversation, and presently it ceased, and all dismounted, as the last body of troops had wheeled into position before their emperor. A member of the staff advanced toward the troops, and calling the name of a soldier, commanded him to advance. The officer then recited the nature of the heroic act that had won the approval of the Jeddak, and the latter advanced and placed a metal ornament upon the left arm of the lucky man. 10 men had been so decorated when the aide called out, "John Carter, Air Scout." Never in my life had I been so surprised, but the habit of military discipline is strong within me, and I dropped my little machine lightly to the ground and advanced on foot as I had seen the others do. As I halted before the officer, he addressed me in a voice audible to the entire assemblage of troops and spectators. "In recognition, John Carter," he said, "of your remarkable courage and skill in defending the person of the cousin of the Jeddak and Nkosis, and, single-handed, vanquishing 3 green warriors, it is the pleasure of our Jeddak to confer on you the mark of his esteem." Then Nkosis then advanced toward me, and, placing an ornament upon me, said, "My cousin has narrated the details of your wonderful achievement, which seems little short of miraculous. And if you can so well defend a cousin of the Jeddak, how much better could you defend the person of the Jeddak himself? You are, therefore, appointed a Padwar of the Guards and will be quartered in my palace hereafter." I thanked him, and at his direction joined the members of his staff. After the ceremony, I returned my machine to its quarters on the roof of the barracks of the Air Scout Squadron, and with an order from the palace to guide me, I reported to the officer in charge of the palace. Chapter 22. I find Dejah. The major domo, to whom I reported, had received instructions. I was to be stationed near the Jeddak. In wartime, a Jeddak is always in great danger of assassination, as all is fair in war seems to be the entire ethic of Martian conflict. Therefore, my guide immediately escorted me to the Nkosis' apartment. The ruler was conversing with his son, Sabden, and several courtiers. He did not notice my entrance. The apartment walls were completely hung with splendid tapestries, hiding any windows or doors. The room was lit by imprisoned sun rays, held between the actual ceiling and what appeared to be a ground glass false, ceiling a few inches below. My guide drew aside one of the tapestries, revealing a passage that encircled the room between the hangings and the chamber walls. I was to remain within this passage, he said, as long as Nkosis was in the apartment. When he left, I was to follow. My only duty was to guard the ruler and stay out of sight as much as possible. I would be relieved after 4 hours. The major domo then left me. The tapestries were strangely woven. They appeared heavily solid from one side, but from my hiding place, I could see everything within a room as easily as if there were no curtain. I had barely reached my post when the tapestry at the opposite end of the chamber parted. 4 soldiers of the guard entered, surrounding a female figure. As they approached Nkosis, the soldiers moved either side, and there, standing before the Jeddak, not 10 feet from me, her beautiful face radiant with smiles, was Dejah Thoris. Sabden, Prince of Zodanga, advanced to meet her. Hand in hand, they approached close to the Jeddak. Then Nkosis looked up in surprise and, rising, saluted her. To what strange whim do I owe this visit from the Princess of Helium? Just 2 days ago, with rare consideration for my pride, she assured me she would prefer Tal Hages, the green Thark, to my son. Dejah Thoris only smiled more. With roguish dimples playing at the corners of her mouth, she answered, "From the beginning of time on Barsoom, it has been the prerogative of women to change their minds as they please and to dissemble in matters concerning the heart. You will forgive that Denkoses, as your son has. 2 days ago, I was not sure of his love for me, but now I am. I have come to beg you to forget my rash words and to accept the assurance of the Princess of Helium that when the time comes, she will wed Sabden, Prince of Zodanga." "I am glad that you have decided so," replied Denkoses. "It is far from my desire to push war further against the people of Helium. Your promise shall be recorded, and a proclamation to my people issued forthwith." "It would be better than Denkoses," interrupted Dejah Thoris, "if the proclamation waits for the ending of this war. It would look strange indeed to my people and to yours if the Princess of Helium were to give herself to her country's enemy in the midst of hostilities." "Cannot the war be ended at once?" spoke Sabdan. "It requires the word of Denkoses to bring peace." "Say it, my father. Say the word that will hasten my happiness and end this unpopular strife." "We shall see," replied Denkoses, "how the people of Helium take to peace. I shall at least offer it to them." Dejah Thoris, after a few words, turned and left the apartment, still followed by her guards. Thus, the edifice of my brief dream of happiness was dashed, broken. To the ground of reality, the woman for whom I had offered my life, and from whose lips I had so recently heard a declaration of love for me, had lightly forgotten my very existence and smilingly given herself to the son of her people's most hated enemy. Although I had heard it with my own ears, I could not believe it. I had to search out her apartments and force her to repeat the cruel truth to me alone before I would be convinced. So I deserted my post and hastened through the passage behind the tapestries toward the door by which she had left the chamber. Slipping quietly through this opening, I discovered a maze of winding corridors, branching and turning in every direction. Running rapidly, first down one and then another, I soon became hopelessly lost. I was standing, panting, against a side wall when I heard voices near me. Apparently, they were coming from the opposite side of the partition I leaned against, and presently I made out the tones of Dejah Thoris. I could not hear the words, but I knew I could not be mistaken in the voice. Moving on a few steps, I discovered another passageway, at the end of which lay a door. Walking boldly forward, I pushed into the room, only to find myself in a small antechamber, where the 4 guards who had accompanied her were present. One of them instantly arose and accosted me, asking the nature of my business. "I am from the Denkoses," I replied, "and wish to speak privately with Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium." "And your order?" asked the fellow. I did not know what he meant, but I replied that I was a member of the guard. Without waiting for his reply, I strode toward the opposite door of the antechamber, behind which I could hear Dejah Thoris conversing. But my entrance was not to be so easily accomplished. The guardsman stepped before me, saying, "No one comes from the Denkoses without carrying an order or the password. You must give me one or the other before you may pass." "The only order I require, my friend, to enter where I will, hangs at my side," I answered, tapping my long sword. "Will you let me pass in peace, or no?" For reply, he whipped out his own sword, calling to the others to join him. Thus, the 4 stood with drawn weapons, barring my further progress. "You are not here by the order of the Denkoses," cried the one who had first addressed me. "Not only shall you not enter the apartments of the Princess of Helium, but you shall go back to the Denkoses under guard to explain this unwarranted temerity. Throw down your sword. You cannot hope to overcome 4 of us," he added with a grim smile. My reply was a quick thrust which left me with but 3 antagonists, and I can assure you that they were worthy of my mettle. They had me backed against the wall in no time, fighting for my life. Slowly, I worked my way to a corner of the room where I could force them to come at me only one at a time. Thus we fought for upward of 20 minutes, the clanging of steel on steel producing a veritable bedlam in the little room. The noise had brought Dejah Thoris to the door of her apartment. She stood there throughout the conflict, with Sola at her back, peering over her shoulder. Her face was set and emotionless, and I knew that she did not recognize me, nor did Sola. Finally, a lucky cut brought down a second guardsman. Then, with only two opposing me, I changed my tactics and rushed them down after the fashion of my fighting that had won me many a victory. The third fell within 10 seconds after the second, and the last lay dead upon the bloody floor a few moments later. They were brave men and noble fighters, and it grieved me that I had been forced to kill them. But I would have willingly depopulated all Barsoom if I could have reached the side of my Dejah Thoris in no other way. Sheathing my bloody blade, I advanced toward my Martian princess, who still stood mutely gazing at me without a sign of recognition. "Who are you, Zodangan?" she whispered. "Another enemy to harass me in my misery?" "I am a friend," I answered, "a once-cherished friend." "No friend of Helium's princess wears that medal," she replied. "And yet the voice. I have heard it before. It is not. It cannot be. No, for he is dead." "It is, though, my princess, none other than John Carter," I said. "Do you not recognize, even through paint and strange metal, the heart of your chieftain?" As I came close to her, she swayed toward me with outstretched hands. But as I reached to take her in my arms, she drew back with a shudder and a little moan of misery. Too late, she grieved. "Oh, my chieftain that was, and whom I thought dead, had you but returned one little hour before. But now it is too late. "What do you mean, Dejah Thoris?" I cried. "That you would not have promised yourself to the Zodangan prince had you known that I lived? Think you, John Carter, that I would give my heart to you yesterday and today to another? I thought that it lay buried with your ashes in the pits of Warhoon, and so today I have promised my body to another to save my people from the curse of the victorious Zodangan army. But I am not dead, my princess. I have come to claim you, and all Zodanga cannot prevent it. It is too late, John Carter. My promise is given, and on Barsoom, that is final. The ceremonies that follow later are but meaningless formalities. They make the fact of marriage no more certain than does the funeral cortege of a Jedak again place the seal of death upon him. I am as good as married, John Carter. No longer may you call me your princess. No longer are you my chieftain. I know but little of your customs here upon Barsoom, Dejah Thoris, but I do know that I love you, and if you meant the last words you spoke to me that day as the hordes of Warhoon were charging down upon us, no other man shall ever claim you as his bride. You meant them then, my princess, and you mean them still. Say that it is true." "I meant them, John Carter," she whispered. "I cannot repeat them now, for I have given myself to another." "Ah, if you had only known our ways, my friend," she continued, half to herself, "the promise would have been yours long months ago, and you could have claimed me before all others. It might have meant the fall of Helium, but I would have given my empire to my Tharkian chief." Then, aloud, she said, "Do you remember the night when you offended me? You called me your princess without having asked my hand, and then you boasted that you had fought for me. You did not know, and I should not have been offended. I see that now. But there was no one to tell you what I could not, that upon Barsoom there are two kinds of women in the cities of the red men. The one they fight for may ask them in marriage. The other kind they fight for also, but never ask their hands. When a man has won a woman, he may address her as his princess, or in any of the several terms which signify possession. You had fought for me, but had never asked me in marriage. And so when you called me your princess, you see," she faltered, "I was hurt. But even then, John Carter, I did not repulse you, as I should have done, until you made it doubly worse by taunting me with having won me through combat. I do not need to ask for your forgiveness now, Dejah Thoris," I cried. You must know that my fault was due to ignorance of your Barsoomian customs. What I failed to do, through implicit belief that my petition be presumptuous and unwelcome, I do now, Dejah Thoris. I ask you be my wife, and by all the Virginian fighting blood that flows in my veins, you shall be. No, John Carter, it is useless, she cried hopelessly. I may never be yours while Sabden lives. You have sealed his death warrant, my princess. Sabden dies. Nor that either, she hastened to explain. I may not wed the man who slays my husband, even in self-defense. It is a custom. We are ruled by custom upon Barsoom. It is useless, my friend. You must bear the sorrow with me. That at least we may share in common. That, and the memory of the brief days among the Tharks. You must go now, nor ever see me again. Goodbye, my chieftain. Disheartened and dejected, I withdrew from the room. But I was not entirely discouraged, nor would I admit that Dejah Thoris was lost to me until the ceremony had actually been performed. As I wandered along the corridors, I was as absolutely lost in the mazes of winding passageways as I had been before I discovered Dejah Thoris's apartments. I knew that my only hope lay in escaping from the city of Zodanga, for the matter of the 4 dead guardsmen would have to be explained. Since I could never reach my original post without a guide, suspicion would surely rest on me as soon as I was discovered wandering aimlessly through the palace. Presently, I came upon a spiral runway leading to a lower floor. I followed this downward for several stories until I reached the doorway of a large apartment, in which were a number of guardsmen. The walls of this room were hung with transparent tapestries, behind which I secreted myself without being apprehended. The conversation of the guardsmen was general and awakened no interest in me until an officer entered the room and ordered 4 of the men to relieve the detail guarding the Princess of Helium. Now I knew my troubles would commence in earnest, and indeed they were upon me all too soon, for it seemed that the squad had scarcely left the guardroom before one of their number burst in again breathlessly, crying that they had found their 4 comrades butchered in the antechamber. Chapter 23. Lost in the sky. Without trying to hide, I hurried towards our quarters, certain I would find Kanto's kin there. As I neared the building, I became more careful, rightly assuming the place would be guarded. Several men in civilian metal loitered near the front entrance, and others were in the rear. My only way to reach our apartments on the upper story unseen was through an adjoining building. After considerable maneuvering, I managed to reach the roof of a shop several doors away. Leaping from roof to roof, I soon reached an open window in the building where I hoped to find a heliumite. In another moment, I stood in the room before him. He was alone and showed no surprise at my arrival, saying he had expected me much earlier, as my tour of duty must have ended some time ago. I realized he knew nothing of the day's events at the palace. When I enlightened him, he became very excited. The news that Dejah Thoris had promised her hand to Sab then filled him with dismay. "It cannot be," he exclaimed. "It is impossible." "Why?" "No man in all Helium would not prefer death to selling our beloved princess to the ruling house of Zodanga. She must have lost her mind to have agreed to such an atrocious bargain. You, who do not know how we of Helium love the members of our ruling house, cannot appreciate the horror with which I contemplate such an unholy alliance. What can be done? John Carter," he continued, "you are a resourceful man. Can you not think of some way to save Helium from this disgrace?" "If I can come within sword's reach of Sab, then," I answered, "I can solve the difficulty as far as Helium is concerned. But for personal reasons, I would prefer that another struck the blow that frees Dejah Thoris." Kantos eyed me narrowly before he spoke. "You love her," he said. "Does she know it?" "She knows it. Kantos can, and repulses me only because she has promised to Sab, then." The splendid fellow sprang to his feet. Grasping me by the shoulder, he raised his sword on high, exclaiming, "And had the choice been left to me, I could not have chosen a more fitting mate for the first princess of Barsoom. Here is my hand upon your shoulder, John Carter, and my word that Sabden shall die at the point of my sword for the sake of my love for Helium, for Dejah Thoris, and for you. This very night I shall try to reach his quarters in the palace. How? I asked. You are strongly guarded, and a quadruple force patrols the sky. He bent his head in thought for a moment, then raised it with an air of confidence. I only need to pass these guards, and I can do it, he said at last. I know a secret entrance to the palace through the pinnacle of the highest tower. I fell upon it by chance one day as I was passing above the palace on patrol duty. In this work, it is required that we investigate any unusual occurrence we may witness. A face peering from a pinnacle of the high tower of the palace was, to me, most unusual. I therefore drew near and discovered that the possessor of the peering face was none other than Sabdan. He was slightly put out at being detected and commanded me to keep the matter to myself, explaining that the passage in the tower led directly to his apartments and was known only to him. If I can reach the roof of the barracks and get my machine, I can be in Sabdan's quarters in 5 minutes. But how am I to escape from this building, guarded as you say it is? How well are the machine sheds at the barracks guarded? I asked. There is usually one man on duty there at night upon the roof. Go to the roof of this building, Cantos can, and wait for me there. Without stopping to explain my plans, I retraced my way to the street and hastened to the barracks. I did not dare enter the building, filled as it was with members of the Air Scout Squadron, who, in common with all Zodanga, were on the lookout for me. The building was enormous, rearing its lofty head fully 1,000 feet into the air. Few buildings in Zodanga were higher than these barracks, though several topped it by a few hundred feet. The docks of the great battleships of the line stood some 1,500 feet from the ground, while the freight and passenger stations of the merchant squadrons rose nearly as high. It was a long climb up the face of the building, and one fraught with much danger, but there was no other way, and so I began the task. The fact that Barsoomian architecture is extremely ornate made the feat much simpler than I had anticipated, since I found ornamental ledges and projections that fairly formed a perfect ladder for me all the way to the eaves of the building. Here I met my first real obstacle. The eaves projected nearly 20 feet from the wall to which I clung, and though I encircled the great building, I could find no opening through them. The top floor was alight and filled with soldiers engaged in their pastimes. I could not, therefore, reach the roof through the building. There was one slight, desperate chance, and that I decided I must take. It was for Dejah Thoris, and no man has lived who would not risk 1,000 deaths such as she. Clinging to the wall with my feet in one hand, I unloosened one of the long leather straps of my trappings, at the end of which dangled a great hook. Air sailors use these hooks to hang to the sides and bottoms of their craft for various repairs, and by means of which landing parties are lowered to the ground from the battleships. I swung this hook cautiously to the roof several times before it finally found lodgment. Gently, I pulled on it to strengthen its hold, but whether it would bear the weight of my body, I did not know. It might be barely caught upon the very outer verge of the roof, so that as my body swung out at the end of the strap, it would slip off and launch me to the pavement 1,000 feet below. For an instant I hesitated. Then, releasing my grasp upon the supporting ornament, I swung out into space at the end of the strap. Far below me lay the brilliantly lighted streets, the hard pavements, and death. There was a little jerk at the top of the supporting eaves, and a nasty, slipping, grating sound that turned me cold with apprehension. Then the hook caught, and I was safe. Clambering quickly aloft, I grasped the edge of the eaves and drew myself to the surface of the roof above. As I gained my feet, I was confronted by the sentry on duty, into the muzzle of whose revolver I found myself looking. "Who are you, and whence came you?" he cried. "I am an air scout, friend, and very near a dead one. For just by chance, I escaped falling to the avenue below." I replied, "But how did you get on the roof, man? No one has landed or come up from the building for the past hour. Quick, explain yourself, or I will call the guard." "Look you here, sentry, and you shall see how I came and how close a shave I had to not coming at all," I answered, turning toward the edge of the roof, where, 20 feet below, at the end of my strap, hung all my weapons. The fellow, acting on an impulse of curiosity, stepped to my side and to his undoing, for as he leaned to peer over the eaves, I grasped him by his throat and his pistol arm and threw him heavily to the roof. The weapon dropped from his grasp, and my fingers choked off his attempted cry for assistance. I gagged and bound him, and then hung him over the edge of the roof, as I myself had hung a few moments before. I knew it would be morning before he would be discovered, and I needed all the time that I could gain. Donning my trappings and weapons, I hastened to the sheds, and soon had out both my machine and Canto's cans. Making as fast behind mine, I started my engine, and skimming over the edge of the roof, I dove down into the streets of the city, far below the plane usually occupied by the air patrol. In less than a minute, I was settling safely upon the roof of our apartment beside the astonished Canto's can. I lost no time in explanation, but plunged immediately into a discussion of our plans for the immediate future. It was decided that I was to try to make helium while Canto's was to enter the palace and dispatch Sabdan. If successful, he was then to follow me. He set my compass for me, a clever little device which will remain steadfastly fixed upon any given point on the surface of Barsoom. Bidding each other farewell, we rose together and sped in the direction of the palace, which lay in the route I must take to reach helium. As we neared the high tower, a patrol shot down from above, throwing its piercing searchlight full upon my craft. A voice roared out a command to halt, followed by a shot as I paid no attention to his hail. Cantos can drop quickly into the darkness, while I rose steadily and at terrific speed raced through the Martian sky, followed by a dozen of the air scout craft that had joined pursuit, and later by a swift cruiser carrying 100 men and a battery of rapid-fire guns. By twisting and turning my little machine, now rising and now falling, I managed to elude their searchlights most of the time, but I was also losing ground by these tactics. So I decided to hazard everything on a straight course and leave the result to fate and the speed of my machine. Cantos can show me a trick of gearing, known only to the Navy of Helium, that greatly increased the speed of our machines. So I felt sure I could distance my pursuers if I could dodge their projectiles for a few moments. As I sped through the air, the screeching of the bullets around me convinced me that only by a miracle could I escape. But the die was cast, and throwing on full speed, I raced a straight course toward helium. Gradually, I left my pursuers further and further behind, and I was just congratulating myself on my lucky escape when a well-directed shot from the cruiser exploded at the prow of my little craft. The concussion nearly capsized her, and with a sickening plunge, she hurtled downward through the dark night. How far I fell before I regained control of the plane, I do not know, but I must have been very close to the ground when I started to rise again, as I plainly heard the squealing of animals below me. Rising again, I scanned the heavens for my pursuers, and finally, making out their lights far behind me, saw that they were landing, evidently in search of me. Not until their lights were no longer discernible did I venture to flash my little lamp upon my compass. Then I found, to my consternation, that a fragment of the projectile had utterly destroyed my only guide, as well as my speedometer. It was true I could follow the stars in the general direction of helium, but without knowing the exact location of the city or the speed at which I was traveling, my chances for finding it were slim. Helium lies 1,000 miles southwest of Zodanga, and with my compass intact, I should have made the trip, barring accidents, in between 4 and 5 hours. As it turned out, however, this morning I found myself speeding over a vast expanse of Dead Sea bottom after nearly 6 hours of continuous flight at high speed. Presently, a great city showed below me, but it was not helium, as that alone of all Barsoomian metropolises consists of 2 immense circular-walled cities about 75 miles apart, and would have been easily distinguishable from the altitude at which I was flying. Believing that I had come too far to the north and west, I turned back in a southeasterly direction, passing during the forenoon several other large cities, but none resembling the description Cantos can have given me of helium. In addition to the twin city formation of helium, another distinguishing feature is the 2 immense towers, one of vivid scarlet, rising nearly a mile into the air from the center of one of the cities, while the other, a bright yellow and of the same height, marks her sister. Chapter 24. Tars Tarkas Find a Friend. About noon, I flew low over a great, dead city of ancient Mars. As I skimmed across the plain beyond, I came upon several thousand green warriors engaged in a terrific battle. Scarcely had I seen them when a volley of shots was directed at me, and with their almost unfailing accuracy, my little craft was instantly a ruined wreck, sinking erratically to the ground. I fell almost directly into the center of the fierce combat, among warriors who had been so busily engaged in life and death struggles that they hadn't seen my approach. The men were fighting on foot with long swords, while an occasional shot from a sharpshooter on the outskirts of the conflict would bring down a warrior who might, for an instant, separate himself from the entangled mass. As my machine sank among them, I realized it was fight or die, with good chances of dying, in any event. So I struck the ground with my long sword drawn, ready to defend myself as best I could. I fell beside a huge monster who was engaged with 3 antagonists. As I glanced at his fierce face, filled with the light of battle, I recognized Tarkas, the Thark. He did not see me, as I was a trifle behind him, and just then the 3 warriors opposing him, whom I recognized as Warhoons, charged simultaneously. The mighty fellow made quick work of one of them, but in stepping back for another thrust, he tripped over a dead body behind him. In an instant, he was down and at the mercy of his foes. Quick as lightning, they were upon him. Tarkas would have been gathered to his fathers in short order had I not sprung before his prostrate form and engaged his adversaries. I had accounted for one of them when the mighty Thark regained his feet and quickly settled the other. He gave me one look, and a slight smile touched his grim lip. Touching my shoulder, he said, "I would scarcely recognize you, John Carter. But there is no other mortal upon Barsoom who would have done what you have for me. I think I have learned that there is such a thing as friendship, my friend." He said no more, nor was there opportunity, for the Warhoons were closing in about us. Together, we fought, shoulder to shoulder, during all that long, hot afternoon, until the tide of battle turned. The remnant of the fierce Warhoon horde fell back upon their thoughts and fled into the gathering darkness. 10,000 men had been engaged in that titanic struggle, and upon the field of battle lay 3,000 dead. Neither side asked nor gave quarter, nor did they attempt to take prisoners. On our return to the city after the battle, we went directly to Tarkas's quarters. I was left alone while the chieftain attended the customary council that immediately follows an engagement. As I sat awaiting the return of the Green Warrior, I heard something move in an adjoining apartment. As I glanced up, a huge and hideous creature suddenly rushed upon me, bearing me backward upon the pile of silks and furs where I had been reclining. It was Woola, faithful, loving Woola. He had found his way back to Thark and, as Tarkas later told me, had gone immediately to my former quarters, where he had taken up his pathetic and seemingly hopeless watch for my return. "Dejah knows that you are here, John Carter," said Tarkas on his return from the Jedak's quarters. "Sarkoja saw and recognized you as we were returning. Dejah has ordered me to bring you before him tonight. I have 10 loats, John Carter. You may take your choice from among them, and I will accompany you to the nearest waterway that leads to Helium. Tarkas may be a cruel green warrior, but he can be a friend as well. Come, we must start. And when you return, Tarkas?" I asked. "The wild Kalos possibly, or worse," he replied. "Unless I should have a chance to have the opportunity one has so long waited for, of battling with Dejah. We will stay Tarkas and see Dejah tonight. You shall not sacrifice yourself, and it may be that tonight you can have the chance to wait." He objected strenuously, saying that Dejah often flew into wild fits of passion at the mere thought of the blow I had dealt him, and that if ever he laid his hands upon me, I would be subjected to the most horrible tortures. While we were eating, I repeated to Tarkas the story Sola had told me that night upon the sea bottom during the march to Thark. He said little, but the great muscles of his face worked in passion and agony at the recollection of the horrors that had been heaped upon the only thing he had ever loved in all his cold, cruel, terrible existence. He no longer demurred when I suggested we go before Dejah, only saying that he would like to speak to Sarkoja first. At his request, I accompanied him to her quarters. The look of venomous hatred she cast upon me was almost adequate recompense for any future misfortunes this accidental return to Thark might bring me. Sarkoja, said Tarkas, 40 years ago, you were instrumental in bringing about the torture and death of a woman named Gozava. I have just discovered that the warrior who loved that woman has learned of your part in the transaction. He may not kill you, Sarkoja. It is not our custom. But there is nothing preventing him from tying one end of a strap about your neck and the other end to a wild throat, merely to test your fitness to survive and help perpetuate our race. Having heard that he would do this on the morrow, I thought it only right to warn you, for I am a just man. The river ISS is but a short pilgrimage. Sarkoja. Come, John Carter. The next morning, Sarkoja was gone, nor was she ever seen again. In silence, we hastened to the Jedak's palace, where we were immediately admitted to his presence. In fact, he could scarcely wait to see me and was standing erect upon his platform, glowering at the entrance as I came in. "Strap him to that pillar," he shrieked. "We shall see who dares strike the mighty Dejah. Heat the irons. With my own hands, I shall burn the eyes from his head, so that he may not pollute my person with his vile gaze." "Chieftains of Thark," I cried, turning to the assembled council and ignoring Dejah. "I have been a chief among you, and today I have fought for Thark shoulder to shoulder with her greatest warrior. You owe me at least a hearing. I have won that much today. You claim to be a just people." "Silence!" roared Dejah. "Gag the creature and bind him as I command." "Justice, Dejah!" exclaimed Lorquas Tamil. "Who are you to set aside the customs of ages among the Tharks?" "Yes, justice," echoed a dozen voices, and so, while Dejah fumed and frothing, I continued. "You are a brave people and you love bravery. But where was your mighty Jedak during the fighting today? I did not see him in the thick of battle. He was not there. He rends defenseless women and little children in his lair. But how recently has one of you seen him fight with men? Why, even I, a midget beside him, felled him with a single blow of my fist. Is it of such that the Tharks fashion their Jedaks? There stands beside me now a great Thark, a mighty warrior and a noble man. Chieftains, how does it sound? Tarkas, Jedak of Thark." A roar of deep-toned applause greeted the suggestion. It remains for this council to command, and Dejah must prove his fitness to rule. Were he a brave man, he would invite Tarkas to combat, for he does not love him. But Dejah is afraid. Dejah, your Jedak, is a coward. With my bare hands, I could kill him, and he knows it. After I ceased, there was tense silence, as all eyes were riveted upon Dejah. He did not speak or move, but the blotchy green of his countenance turned livid, and the froth froze upon his lips. "Dejah," said Lorquas Tamil in a cold, hard voice, "never in my long life have I seen a Jedak of Tharks so humiliated. There could be but one answer to this arraignment. We'll wait it." And still, Dejah stood as though petrified. "Chieftains," continued Lorquas Tamil, "shall the Jedak, Dejah, prove his fitness to rule over Tarkas?" There were 20 chieftains about the rostrum, and 20 swords flashed high in assent. There was no alternative. That decree was final, and so Dejah drew his long sword and advanced to meet Tarkas. The combat was soon over, and, with his foot upon the neck of the dead monster, Tarkas became Jedak among the Tharks. His first act was to make me a full-fledged chieftain with the rank I had won by my combats during the first few weeks of my captivity among them. Seeing the favorable disposition of the warriors toward Tarkas, as well as toward me, I grasped the opportunity to enlist them in my cause against Zodanga. I told Tarkas the story of my adventures, and in a few words had explained to him the thought I had in mind. "John Carter has made a proposal," he said, addressing the council, "which meets with my sanction. I shall put it to you briefly. Dejah Thoris, The Princess of Helium, who was our prisoner, is now held by the Jeddak of Zodanga, whose son she must wed to save her country from devastation at the hands of the Zodangan forces. John Carter suggests that we rescue her and return her to Helium. The loot of Zodanga would be magnificent, and I have often thought that had we an alliance with the people of Helium, we could obtain sufficient assurance of sustenance to permit us to increase the size and frequency of our hatchings, and thus become unquestionably supreme among the green men of all Barsoom. What do you say? It was a chance to fight, an opportunity to loot, and they rose to the bait as a speckled trout to a fly. For Tharks, they were wildly enthusiastic, and before another half-hour had passed, 20 mounted messengers were speeding across Dead Sea bottoms to call the hordes together for the expedition. In 3 days, we were on the march towards Zodanga, 100,000 strong, as Tarkas have been able to enlist the services of 3 smaller hordes on the promise of the great loot of Zodanga. At the head of the column, I rode beside the great Thark, while at the heels of my mount trotted my beloved Woola. We traveled entirely by night, timing our marches, so that we camped during the day at deserted cities where, even to the beasts, we were all kept indoors during the daylight hours. On the march, Tarkas, through his remarkable ability and statesmanship, enlisted 50,000 more warriors from various hordes, so that 10 days after we set out, we halted at midnight outside the great walled city of Zodanga, 150,000 strong. The fighting strength and efficiency of this horde of ferocious green monsters was equivalent to 10 times their number of red men. Never in the history of Barsoom, Tarkas told me, had such a force of green warriors marched to battle together. It was a monstrous task to keep even a semblance of harmony among them, and it was a marvel to me that he got them to the city without a mighty battle among themselves. But as we neared Zodanga, their personal quarrels were submerged by their greater hatred for the red men, and especially for the Zodangans, who had for years waged a ruthless campaign of extermination against the green men, directing special attention toward despoiling their incubators. Now that we were before Zodanga, the task of obtaining entry to the city devolved upon me, directing Tarkas to hold his forces in 2 divisions out of earshot of the city, with each division opposite a large gateway. I took 20 dismounted warriors and approached one of the small gates that pierce the walls at short intervals. These gates have no regular guard, but are covered by sentries who patrol the avenue that encircles the city just within the walls, much as our metropolitan police patrol their beats. The walls of Zodanga are 75 feet in height and 50 feet thick. They are built of enormous blocks of carborundum, and the task of entering the city seemed, to my escort of green warriors, an impossibility. The fellows who had been detailed to accompany me were of one of the smaller hordes, and therefore did not know me. Placing 3 of them with their faces to the wall and arms locked, I commanded 2 more to mount to their shoulders, and a 6th I ordered to climb upon the shoulders of the upper 2. The head of the topmost warrior towered over 40 feet from the ground. In this way, with 10 warriors, I built a series of 3 steps in the ground to the shoulders of the topmost man. Then, starting from a short distance behind them, I ran swiftly up from one tier to the next, and with a final bound from the broad shoulders of the highest, I clutched the top of the great wall and quietly drew myself to its broad expanse. After me, I dragged 6 lengths of leather from an equal number of my warriors. These lengths we had previously fastened together, and passing one end to the topmost warrior, I lowered the other end cautiously over the opposite side of the wall toward the avenue below. No one was in sight, so, lowering myself at the end of my leather strap, I dropped the remaining 30 feet to the pavement below. I had learned from Cantos the secret of opening these gates, and in another moment, my 20 great fighting men stood within the doomed city of Zodanga. I found to my delight that I had entered at the lower boundary of the enormous palace grounds. The building itself showed in the distance a blaze of glorious light, and on the instant, I was determined to lead a detachment of warriors directly into the palace itself, while the balance of the great horde was attacking the barracks of the soldiers. Dispatching one of my men to Tarkas for a detail of 50 Tharks, with word of my intentions, I ordered 10 warriors to capture and open one of the great gates, while with the 9 remaining, I took the other. We were to do our work quietly. No shots would be fired, and no general advance made until I had reached the palace with my 50 Tharks. Our plans worked to perfection. The 2 sentries we met were dispatched to their fathers upon the banks of the lost Sea of Chorus, and the guards at both gates followed them in silence. Chapter 25. The Looting of Zodanga. As the great gate where I stood swung open, my 50 Tharks, headed by Tarkas himself, rode in upon their mighty thoughts. I led them to the palace walls, which I negotiated easily without assistance. Once inside, however, the gate gave me considerable trouble, but I finally was rewarded by seeing it swing upon its huge hinges, and soon my fierce escort was riding across the gardens of the Jeddak of Zodanga. As we approached the palace, I could see through the great windows of the first floor into the brilliantly illuminated audience chamber of the Nkoses. The immense hall was crowded with nobles and their women, as though some important function was in progress. There wasn't a guard in sight outside the palace, due, I presume, to the fact that the city and palace walls were considered impregnable, and so I came close and peered within. At one end of the chamber, upon massive golden thrones encrusted with diamonds, sat the Nkoses and his consort, surrounded by officers and dignitaries of state. Before them stretched a broad aisle lined on either side with soldiery, and as I looked, there entered this aisle at the far end of the hall the head of a procession which advanced to the foot of the throne. First, there marched 4 officers of Jeddak's guard bearing a huge salver on which rested, upon a cushion of scarlet silk, a great golden chain with a collar and padlock at each end. Directly behind these officers came 4 others carrying a similar salver, which supported the magnificent ornaments of a prince and princess of the reigning house of Zodanga. At the foot of the throne, these 2 parties separated and halted, facing each other at opposite sides of the aisle. Then came more dignitaries and the officers of the palace and the army, and finally 2 figures entirely muffled in scarlet silk, so that not a feature of either was discernible. These 2 stopped at the foot of the throne, facing the Nkoses. When the balance of the procession had entered and assumed their stations, the Nkoses addressed the couple standing before him. I could not hear his words, but presently 2 officers advanced and removed the scarlet robe from one of the figures, and I saw that Kantos had failed in his mission, for it was Sabd, Prince of Zodanga, who stood revealed before me. Then Nkoses now took a set of the ornaments from one of the salvers and placed one of the collars of gold about his son's neck, springing the padlock fast. After a few more words addressed to Sabdan, he turned to the other figure, from which the officers now removed the enshrouding silks, disclosing to my now comprehending view Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium. The object of the ceremony was clear to me. In another moment, Dejah Thoris would be joined forever to the Prince of Zodanga. It was an impressive and beautiful ceremony, I presume, but to me, it seemed the most fiendish sight I had ever witnessed. As the ornaments were adjusted upon her beautiful figure, and her collar of gold swung open in the hands of the Nkoses, I raised my long sword above my head, and with a heavy hilt, I shattered the glass of the great window and sprang into the midst of the astonished assemblage. With a bound, I was on the steps of the platform beside the Nkoses, and as he stood riveted with surprise, I brought my long sword down upon the golden chain that would have bound Dejah Thoris to another. In an instant, all was confusion. 1,000 drawn swords menaced me from every quarter, and Sabd sprang upon me with a jeweled dagger he had drawn from his nuptial ornaments. I could have killed him as easily as I might a fly, but the age-old custom of Barsoom stayed my hand. Grasping his wrist as the dagger flew toward my heart, I held him as though in a vice, and with my long sword pointed to the far end of the hall. "Zodanga has fallen," I cried. "Look!" All eyes turned in the direction I had indicated, and there, forging to the portals of the entranceway, rode Tarkas and his 50 warriors on their great thoughts. A cry of alarm and amazement broke from the assemblage, but no word of fear, and in a moment, the soldiers and nobles of Zodanga were hurling themselves upon the advancing Tharks. Thrusting Sabd headlong from the platform, I drew Dejah Thoris to my side. Behind the throne was a narrow doorway, and in this, the Nkoses now stood facing me, with a drawn long sword. In an instant, we were engaged, and I found no mean antagonist. As we circled upon the broad platform, I saw Sabden rushing up the steps to aid his father. But as he raised his hand to strike, Dejah Thoris sprang before him, and then my sword found the spot that made Sabden Jedak of Zodanga. As his father rolled dead upon the floor, the new Jedak tore himself free from Dejah Thoris's grasp, and again we faced each other. He was soon joined by a quartet of officers, and, with my back against the golden throne, I fought once again for Dejah Thoris. I was hard-pressed to defend myself, and yet not strike down Sabden, and, with him, my last chance to win the woman I loved. My blade was swinging with the rapidity of lightning, as I sought to parry the thrusts and cuts of my opponents. 2 I had disarmed, and 1 was down, when several more rushed to the aid of their new ruler and to avenge the death of the old. With my back against the golden throne, I fought once again for Dejah Thoris. As they advanced, there were cries of, "The woman! The woman! Strike her down! It is her plot! Kill her! Kill her!" Calling to Dejah Thoris to get behind me, I worked my way toward the little doorway back of the throne, but the officers realized my intentions, and 3 of them sprang behind me and blocked my chances for gaining a position where I could have defended Dejah Thoris against an army of swordsmen. The Tharks were having their hands full in the center of the room, and I began to realize that nothing short of a miracle could save Dejah Thoris and myself, when I saw Tars Tarkas surging through the crowd of pygmies that swarmed about him. With one swing of his mighty longsword, he laid a dozen corpses at his feet, and so he hewed a pathway before him until, in another moment, he stood upon the platform beside me, dealing death and destruction right and left. The bravery of his Odangans was awe-inspiring. Not one attempted to escape, and when the fighting ceased, it was because only Tharks remained alive in the great hall, other than Dejah Thoris and myself. Sabden lay dead beside his father, and the corpses of the flower of Zodangan nobility and chivalry covered the floor of the bloody shambles. My first thought when the battle was over was for Kandos Khan, and leaving Dejah Thoris in charge of Tars Tarkas, I took a dozen warriors and hastened to the dungeons beneath the palace. The jailers had all left to join the fighters in the throne room, so we searched the labyrinthine prison without opposition. I called Kandos Khan's name aloud in each new corridor and compartment, and finally, I was rewarded by hearing a faint response. Guided by the sound, we soon found him helpless in a dark recess. He was overjoyed at seeing me, and to know the meaning of the fight, faint echoes of which had reached his prison cell. He told me that the air patrol had captured him before he reached the high tower of the palace, so that he had not even seen Sabden. We discovered that it would be futile to attempt to cut away the bars and chains which held him prisoner. So, at his suggestion, I returned to search the bodies on the floor above for keys to open the padlocks of his cell and of his chains. Fortunately, among the first I examined, I found his jailer, and soon we had Kandos Khan with us in the throne room. The sound of heavy firing, mingled with shouts and cries, came to us from the city streets, and Tars Tarkas hastened away to direct the fighting outside. Kandos Khan accompanied him to act as guide. The Green Warriors commenced a thorough search of the palace for other Zodangans and for loot, and Dejah Thoris and I were left alone. She had sunk into one of the golden thrones, and as I turned to her, she greeted me with a wan smile. "Was there ever such a man?" she exclaimed. "I know that Barsoom has never before seen your like. Can it be that all Earthmen are as you? Alone, a stranger, hunted, threatened, persecuted. You have done in a few short months what in all the past ages of Barsoom no man has ever done, joined together the wild hordes of sea bottoms and brought them to fight as allies of a red Martian people." "The answer is easy, Dejah Thoris," I replied, smiling. "It was not I who did it. It was love for Dejah Thoris, a power that would work greater miracles than this you have seen." A pretty flush overspread her face, and she answered, "You may say that now, John Carter, and I may listen, for I am free." "And more still I have to say ere it is again too late," I returned. "I have done many strange things in my life, Many things that wiser men would not have dared, but never in my wildest fancies have I dreamed of winning a Dejah Thoris for myself. For never had I dreamed that in all the universe dwelt such a woman as the Princess of Helium. That you are a princess does not abash me, but that you are you is enough to make me doubt my sanity as I ask you, my princess, to be mine. He does not need to be abashed who so well knew the answer to his plea before the plea was made, she replied, rising and placing her dear hands upon my shoulders. And so I took her in my arms and kissed her. And thus, in the midst of a city of wild conflict, filled with the alarms of war, with death and destruction reaping their terrible harvest around her, did Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium, true daughter of Mars, the god of war, promise herself in marriage to John Carter, gentleman of Virginia. Chapter 26. Through carnage to joy. Some time later, Tars Tarkas and Cantos can reported that Zodanga had been completely subdued. Her forces were entirely destroyed or captured, and no further resistance was expected from within. Several battleships had escaped, but thousands of war and merchant vessels were now under the guard of Thark warriors. The lesser hordes had begun looting and quarreling among themselves. So, we decided to gather what warriors we could, man as many vessels as possible with Zodangan prisoners, and depart for Helium without further delay. 5 hours later, we sailed from the roofs of the dock buildings with a fleet of 250 battleships, carrying nearly 100,000 green warriors. These were followed by a fleet of transports with our Ardoats. Behind us, we left the devastated city in the fierce and brutal clutches of some 40,000 green warriors from the lesser hordes. They were looting, murdering, and fighting amongst themselves. In 100 places, they had set fires, and columns of dense smoke rose above the city, as if to blot out the horrid sights beneath from the eye of heaven. In the middle of the afternoon, we sighted the scarlet and yellow towers of Helium. A short time later, a great fleet of Zodangan battleships rose from the besiegers' camps outside the city and advanced to meet us. The banners of Helium had been strung from stem to stern of each of our mighty craft, but the Zodangans didn't need this sign to realize we were enemies. Our green Martian warriors had opened fire upon them almost as they left the ground. With uncanny marksmanship, they raked the oncoming fleet with volley after volley. The twin cities of Helium, perceiving that we were friends, sent out hundreds of vessels to aid us. Then began the first real air battle I had ever witnessed. The vessels carrying our green warriors circled above the contending fleets of Helium and Zodanga. Their batteries were useless in the hands of the Tharks, who, having no navy, had no skill in naval gunnery. Their small-arm fire, however, was most effective, and the final outcome of the engagement was strongly influenced, if not wholly determined, by their presence. At first, the two forces circled at the same altitude, pouring broadside after broadside into each other. Presently, a great hole was torn in the hull of one of the immense battlecrafts from the Zodangan camp. With a lurch, she turned completely over, the little figures of her crew plunging, turning, and twisting toward the ground 1,000 feet below. Then, with sickening velocity, she tore after them, almost completely burying herself in the soft loam of the ancient seabed. A wild cry of exultation arose from the Heliumite squadron, and with redoubled ferocity, they fell upon the Zodangan fleet. By a clever maneuver, two of Helium's vessels gained a position above their adversaries, for which they pour a perfect torrent of exploding bombs from their keel bomb batteries. Then, one by one, Helium's battleships succeeded in rising above the Zodangans. In a short time, a number of the beleaguering battleships were drifting as hopeless wrecks toward the high scarlet tower of Greater Helium. Several others attempted to escape, but they were soon surrounded by thousands of tiny individual flyers, and above each hung a monster battleship of Helium, ready to drop boarding parties onto their decks. Within a little over an hour from the moment the victorious Zodangan squadron had risen to meet us from the besiegers' camp, the battle was over. The remaining vessels of the conquered Zodangans were headed toward the cities of Helium under prize crews. There was an extremely pathetic side to the surrender of these mighty flyers, the result of an age-old custom. It demanded that surrender be signaled by the voluntary plunging to earth of the commander of the vanquished vessel, one after another. The brave men, holding their colors high above their heads, leaped from the towering bows of their mighty craft to an awful death. Only when the commander of the entire fleet took the fearful plunge, thus indicating surrender of the remaining vessels, did the fighting cease, and the useless sacrifice of brave men came to an end. We now signaled the flagship of Helium's navy to approach. When she was within hailing distance, I called out that we had Princess Dejah Thoris on board, and wished to transfer her to the flagship, so she might be taken immediately to the city. As the full import of my announcement bore upon them, a great cry arose from the decks of the flagship. A moment later, the colors of the Princess of Helium broke from 100 points upon her upper works. When the other vessels of the squadron caught the meaning of the signals that flashed to them, they took up the wild acclaim and unfurled her colors in the gleaming sunlight. The flagship bore down upon us, and as she swung gracefully and touched our side, a dozen officers sprang upon our decks. As their astonished gaze fell upon the hundreds of green warriors, who now emerged from the fighting shelters, they stopped aghast. But at the sight of Kanto's Kan, who advanced to meet them, they came forward, crowding about him. Dejah Thoris and I then advanced, and they had eyes only for her. She received them gracefully, calling each by name, for they were men highly esteemed in the service of her grandfather, and she knew them well. "Lay your hands upon the shoulder of John Carter," she said to them, turning toward me, "the man to whom Helium owes her princess, as well as her victory today." They were very courteous to me, and said many kind and complimentary things. But what seemed to impress them most was that I had won the aid of the fierce Tharks in my campaign for the liberation of Dejah Thoris and the relief of Helium. "You owe your thanks more to another man than to me," I said, "and here he is. Meet one of Barsoom's greatest soldiers and statesmen, Tars Tarkas, Dejah Thoris." With the same polished courtesy that had marked their manner toward me, they extended their greetings to the great Thark. To my surprise, he was not much behind them in ease of bearing or in courtly speech. Though not a garrulous race, the Tharks are extremely formal, and their ways lend themselves amazingly to dignified and courtly manners. Dejah Thoris went aboard the flagship, and was much put out that I would not follow. But, as I explained to her, the battle was only partly won. We still had the land forces of besieging Zodangans to account for, and I would not leave Tars Tarkas until that had been accomplished. The commander of Helium's naval forces promised to arrange for the armies of Helium to attack from the city in conjunction with our land assault. So the vessels separated, and Dejah Thoris was borne in triumph back to the court of her grandfather, Tardos Mors, Jeddak of Helium. In the distance lay our fleet of transports, with the thoughts of the Green Warriors, where they had remained during the battle. Without landing stages, it would be difficult to unload these beasts upon the open plain, but there was no other option. So we set out for a point about 10 miles from the city and began the task. It was necessary to lower the animals to the ground in slings, and this work occupied the remainder of the day and half the night. Twice we were attacked by parties of Zodangan cavalry, but with little loss. After darkness fell, they withdrew. As soon as the last oat was unloaded, Tars Tarkas gave the command to advance, and in 3 parties, we crept upon the Zodangan camp from the north, south, and east. About a mile from the main camp, we encountered their outposts. As had been prearranged, we accepted this as a signal to charge. With wild, ferocious cries and amidst the nasty squealing of battle-enraged Oats, we bore down upon the Zodangans. We didn't catch them napping, but found a well-entrenched battle line confronting us. Time after time, we were repulsed until, toward noon, I began to fear for the battle's outcome. The Zodangans numbered nearly 1 million fighting men, gathered from pole to pole wherever their ribbon-like waterways stretched, while pitted against them were less than 100,000 green warriors. The forces from Helium had not arrived, nor could we receive any word from them. Just at noon, we heard heavy firing all along the line between the Zodangans and the cities, and we knew then that our much-needed reinforcements had come. Again, Tars Tarkas ordered the charge, and once more the mighty Thoats bore their terrible riders against the enemy's ramparts. At the same moment, Helium's battle line surged over the opposite breastworks of the Zodangans, and in another moment, they were being crushed as between two millstones. Nobly they fought, but in vain. The plain before the city became a veritable shambles before the last Zodangan surrendered, but finally the carnage ceased. The prisoners were marched back to Helium, and we entered the greater city's gates, a huge triumphal procession of conquering heroes. The broad avenues were lined with women and children, among whom were the few men whose duties necessitated that they remain within the city during the battle. We were greeted with an endless round of applause and showered with ornaments of gold, platinum, silver, and precious jewels. The city had gone mad with joy. My fierce Tharks caused the wildest excitement and enthusiasm. Never before had an armed body of green warriors entered the gates of Helium, and that they came now as friends and allies filled the red men with rejoicing. That my poor services to Dejah Thoris had become known to the Heliumites was evidenced by the loud crying of my name and by the loads of ornaments fastened upon me and my huge throat as we passed up the avenues to the palace. For even in the face of Wula's ferocious appearance, the populace pressed close about me. As we approached this magnificent building, we were met by a party of officers who greeted us warmly. They requested that Tars Tarkas and his Jeds, with the Jedaks and Jeds as wild allies, along with myself, dismount and accompany them to receive an expression of gratitude from Tardos Moors for our services. At the top of the great steps leading up to the main portals of the palace stood the royal party, and as we reached the lower steps, one of their number descended to meet us. He was an almost perfect specimen of manhood, tall, straight as an arrow, superbly muscled, and with the carriage and bearing of a ruler of men. I didn't need to be told that he was Tardos Moors, Jedak of Helium. The first member of our party he met was Tars Tarkas, and his first words sealed forever the new friendship between the races. That Tardos Moors, he said earnestly, may meet the greatest living warrior of Barsoom is a priceless honor, but that he may lay his hand on the shoulder of a friend and ally is a far greater boon. Jedak of Helium, returned Tars Tarkas, it has remained for a man of another world to teach the green warriors of Barsoom the meaning of friendship. To him, we owe the fact that the hordes of Thar can understand you, that they can appreciate and reciprocate the sentiments so graciously expressed. Tardos Moors then greeted each of the green Jedaks and Jeds, and to each spoke word of friendship and appreciation. As he approached me, he laid both hands upon my shoulders. "Welcome, my son," he said, "that you are granted, gladly and without one word of opposition, the most precious jewel in all Helium, yes, on all Barsoom, is sufficient earnest of my esteem." We were then presented to Morris Kajak, Jed of Lesser Helium and father of Dejah Thoris. He had followed close behind Tardos Moors, and seemed even more affected by the meeting than his father had been. He tried a dozen times to express his gratitude to me, but his voice choked with emotion, and he could not speak. And yet, as I was to later learn, he had a reputation for ferocity and fearlessness as a fighter that was remarkable even upon warlike Barsoom. In common with all Helium, he worshipped his daughter, nor could he think of what she had escaped without deep emotion. Chapter 27. From Joy to Death. For 10 days, the hordes of Thark and their wild allies were feasted and entertained. Then, loaded with costly presents and escorted by 10,000 soldiers of Helium commanded by Morris Kajak, they began the return journey to their own lands. The Jed of Lesser Helium, with a small party of nobles, accompanied them all the way to Thark to strengthen the new bonds of peace and friendship. Sola also accompanied Tars Tarkas, her father, who had acknowledged her as his daughter before all his chieftains. 3 weeks later, Morris Kajak and his officers, accompanied by Tars Tarkas and Sola, returned upon a battleship that had been dispatched to Thark. They arrived in time for the ceremony that would unite Dejah Thoris and John Carter. For 9 years, I served in the councils and fought in the armies of Helium as a prince of the house of Tardos Moors. The people seemed never to tire of bestowing honors upon me, and no day passed without some new proof of their love for my princess, the incomparable Dejah Thoris. In a golden incubator upon the roof of our palace lay a snow-white egg. For nearly 5 years, 10 soldiers of the Jedak's Guard had constantly stood over it. Not a day passed when I was in the city that Dejah Thoris and I did not stand hand in hand before our little shrine, planning for the future, when the delicate shell should break. Vivid in my memory is the picture of the last night as we sat there, talking in low tones of the strange romance that had woven our lives together, and of this wonder that was coming to augment our happiness and fulfill our hopes. In the distance, we saw the bright white light of an approaching airship, but we attached no special significance to such a common sight. Like a bolt of lightning, it raced toward helium until its very speed bespoke the unusual, flashing the signals that proclaimed it a dispatch bearer for the Jedak. It circled impatiently, awaiting the tardy patrol boat that must convoy it to the palace docks. 10 minutes after it touched the palace, a message called me to the council chamber, which I found filled with the members of that body. On the raised platform of the throne was Tardos Mors, pacing back and forth with a tense, drawn face. When all were in their seats, he turned toward us. "This morning," he said, "word reached the several governments of Barsoom that the keeper of the atmosphere plan had made no wireless report for 2 days, nor had almost ceaseless calls upon him from a score of capitals elicited a sign of response. The ambassadors of the other nations asked us to take the matter in hand and hasten the assistant keeper to plant. All day, 1,000 cruisers have been searching for him, until just now one of them returns bearing his dead body, which was found in the pits beneath his house, horribly mutilated by some assassin. I don't need to tell you what this means to Barsoom. It would take months to penetrate those mighty walls. In fact, the work has already commenced, and there would be little to fear were the engine of the pumping plant to run as it should, and as they all have for hundreds of years. But the worst, we fear, has happened. The instruments show a rapidly decreasing air pressure on all parts of Barsoom. The engine has stopped. My gentlemen," he concluded, "we have at best 3 days to live." There was absolute silence for several minutes. Then a young noble arose, and with his drawn sword held high above his head, addressed Tardos Mors. "The men of Helium have prided themselves that they have ever shown Barsoom how a nation of red men should live. Now is our opportunity to show them how they should die. Let us go about our duties, as though 1,000 useful years still lay before us." The chamber rang with applause. As there was nothing better to do than to allay the fears of the people by our example, we went our ways with smiles upon our faces and sorrow gnawing at our hearts. When I returned to my palace, I found that the rumor had already reached Dejah Thoris. So I told her all that I had heard. "We have been very happy, John Carter," she said, "and I thank whatever fate overtakes us that it permits us to die together." The next 2 days brought no noticeable change in the supply of air, but on the morning of the 3rd day, breathing became difficult at the higher altitudes of the rooftops. The avenues and plazas of Helium were filled with people. All business had ceased. For the most part, the people looked bravely into the face of their unalterable doom. Here and there, however, men and women gave way to quiet grief. Toward the middle of the day, many of the weaker ones began to succumb, and within an hour, the people of Barsoom were sinking by thousands into the unconsciousness that precedes death by asphyxiation. Dejah Thoris and I, with the other members of the royal family, had gathered in a sunken garden within an inner courtyard of the palace. We conversed in low tones, when we conversed at all, as the awe of the grim shadow of death crept over us. Even Woola seemed to feel the weight of the impending calamity, for he pressed close to Dejah Thoris and to me, whining pitifully. The little incubator had been brought from the roof of our palace at the request of Dejah Thoris, and she sat gazing longingly upon the unknown little life that now she would never know. As it became perceptibly difficult to breathe, Tardos Mors arose, saying, "Let us bid each other farewell. The days of Barsoom's greatness are over. Tomorrow's sun will look down upon a dead world which through all eternity must go swinging through the heavens, populated not even by memories. It is the end." He stooped and kissed the women of his family, and laid his strong hand upon the shoulders of the men. As I turned sadly from him, My eyes fell upon Dejah Thoris. Her head was drooping upon her breast. To all appearances, she was lifeless. With a cry, I sprang to her and raised her in my arms. Her eyes opened and looked into mine. "Kiss me, John Carter," she murmured. "I love you. I love you. It is cruel that we must be torn apart, we who were just starting upon a life of love and happiness." As I pressed her dear lips to mine, the old feeling of unconquerable power and authority rose in me. The fighting blood of Virginia sprang to life in my veins. "It shall not be, my princess," I cried. There must be some way, and John Carter, who has fought his way through a strange world for the love of you, will find it." And with my words, there crept above the threshold of my conscious mind a series of 9 long-forgotten sounds. Like a flash of lightning in the darkness, their full import dawned upon me. The key to the 3 great doors of the atmosphere plant. Turning suddenly toward Tardo's moors, as I still clasped my dying love to my breast, I cried, "A flyer, Jedak, quick! Order your swiftest flyer to the palace top. I can save Barsoom yet." He did not wait to question, but in an instant a guard was racing to the nearest dock. Though the air was thin and almost gone at the rooftop, they managed to launch the fastest one-man air scout machine that the skill of Barsoom had ever produced. Kissing Dejah Thoris a dozen times and commanding Woola, who would have followed me, to remain and guard her, I bounded with my old agility and strength to the high ramparts of the palace, and in another moment I was headed toward the goal of the hopes of all Barsoom. I had to fly low to get sufficient air to breathe, but I took a straight course across an old sea bottom, and so had to rise only a few feet above the ground. I traveled with awful velocity, for my errand was a race against time with death. The face of Dejah Thoris hung always before me. As I turned for a last look as I left the palace garden, I had seen her stagger and sink upon the ground beside the little incubator. That she had dropped into the last coma which would end in death if the air supply remained unreplenished, I well knew. So, throwing caution to the winds, I flung overboard everything but the engine and compass, even my ornaments, lying on my belly along the deck with one hand on the steering wheel, and the other pushing the speed lever to its last notch. I split the thin air of dying Mars with the speed of a meteor. An hour before dark, the great walls of the atmosphere plant loomed suddenly before me, and with a sickening thud, I plunged to the ground before the small door that was withholding the spark of life from the inhabitants of an entire planet. Beside the door, a great crew of men had been laboring to pierce the wall, but they had scarcely scratched the flint-like surface. Now most of them lay in the last sleep, from which not even air would awaken them. Conditions seemed much worse here than at Helium, and it was with difficulty that I breathed at all. There were a few men still conscious, and to one of these I spoke. "If I can open these doors, is there a man who can start the engines?" I asked. "I can," he replied. "If you open quickly. I can last but a few moments more. But it is useless. They are both dead, and no one else upon Barsoom knows the secret of these awful locks." For 3 days, men crazed with fear have surged about this portal in vain attempts to solve its mystery. I had no time to talk. I was becoming very weak, and it was with difficulty that I controlled my mind at all. But with final effort, as I sank weakly to my knees, I hurled the 9 thought waves at that awful thing before me. The Martian had crawled to my side, and with staring eyes fixed on the single panel before us. We waited in the silence of death. Slowly, the mighty door receded before us. I attempted to rise and follow it, but I was too weak. After it, I cried to my companion, "And if you reach the pump room, turn loose all the pumps. It is the only chance Barsoom has to exist tomorrow." From where I lay, I opened the second door, and then the third. As I saw the hope of Barsoom crawling weakly on hands and knees through the last doorway, I sank unconscious upon the ground. Chapter 28. At the Arizona Cave. It was dark when I opened my eyes again. Strange, stiff garments covered my body, garments that cracked and powdered away as I rose to a sitting position. I felt myself over from head to foot. I was clothed, though when I had fallen unconscious at the little doorway, I had been naked. Before me was a small patch of moonlit sky, visible through a ragged opening. As my hands passed over my body, they came in contact with pockets, and in one of these I found a small parcel of matches wrapped in oiled paper. I struck one of these matches, and its dim flame lit up what appeared to be a huge cave. Toward the back, I discovered a strange, still figure huddled over a tiny bench. As I approached it, I saw that it was the dead and mummified remains of a little old woman with long black hair. The thing she leaned over was a small charcoal burner, upon which rested a round copper vessel, containing a small quantity of greenish powder. Behind her, hanging from a roof upon rawhide thongs and stretching entirely across the cave, was a row of human skeletons. From the thong that held them, another stretched to the dead hand of the little old woman. As I touched the cord, the skeleton swung with a noise like the rustling of dry leaves. It was a most grotesque and horrid tableau, and I hastened out into the fresh air, glad to escape from such a gruesome place. The sight that met my eyes as I stepped out onto a small ledge before the cave entrance filled me with consternation. A new heaven and a new landscape met my gaze. The silvered mountains in the distance, the almost stationary moon hanging in the sky, the cacti-studded valley below me. These were not a Mars. I could scarcely believe my eyes, but the truth slowly forced itself upon me. I was looking upon Arizona from the same ledge from which, 10 years before, I had gazed with longing upon Mars. Burying my head in my arms, I turned, broken and sorrowful, down the trail from the cave. Above me shone the red eye of Mars, holding her awful secret, 48 million miles away. Did the Martian reach the pump room? Did the vitalizing air reach the people of that distant planet in time to save them? Was my Dejah Thoris alive, or did her beautiful body lie cold in death beside the tiny golden incubator in the sunken garden of the inner courtyard of the palace of Tardos Moors? The Jedak of Helium? For 10 years, I have waited and prayed for an answer to my questions. For 10 years, I have waited and prayed to be taken back to the world of my lost love. I would rather lie dead beside her there than live on earth all those millions of terrible miles from her. The old mine, which I found untouched, has made me fabulously wealthy. But what care do I for wealth? As I sit here tonight in my little study overlooking the Hudson, just 20 years have passed since I first opened my eyes upon Mars. I can see her shining in the sky through the little window by my desk. Tonight, she seems to be calling to me again, as she has not called before since that long-dead night. I think I can see, across that awful abyss of space, a beautiful black-haired woman standing in the garden of the palace. At her side is a little boy who puts his arm around her as she points in the sky toward the planet Earth, while at their feet is a huge and hideous creature with a heart of gold. I believe that they are waiting there for me, and something tells me that I shall soon know.